welcome everybody to the Financial Wellbeing Workshop today. Thank you for joining us. We are so excited that you're here. This event is hosted by University Life. My name is Antonia Forica. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at the Office of University Life as a program manager on the Student Life team. And this event is hosted as part of Welcome Home Columbia, which is happening until Friday. They're always the first 2 weeks of every new start to the semester. And we're here with Trista from Student Financial Services. Thank you. She'll be our presenter today. We'd like to open today's event by actually looking at the 7 dimensions of well-being that Columbia uses. So as you might see on this graphic, there is a career, emotional, financial, intellectual, relational, physical, and spiritual dimension to your well-being. And these are happening all the time. Well-being is an active process. While this event certainly does aim to promote the financial dimension of well-being, you might find that you relate more to relational or intellectual dimensions by the end of this, which just shows and highlights the diversity of your well-being journey. So please keep these dimensions in mind as we go through our event today. So I'm so excited to stop sharing this and send it over to our presenter to introduce herself and share her presentation. Thank you so much.
Antonia, thank you. And hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. For anybody that has not had the opportunity to sit with me in one of these sessions before, my name's Trista, and I'm the manager of financial aid operations and training here at the university. I have to think about it every time I say it. It's long. But my favorite part of my job is actually what I have the opportunity to do here with you today, is talk a little bit about financial literacy and financial wellness. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen, and please forgive me as I do that rather quietly because I'm not good at doing 2 things at once. All right. And can I ask if I can get a thumbs up or a hello in the chat if we can see everything? Thank you. Awesome. Fantastic. It's also how I know everybody's with me. All right, so very quickly before we get started, today's presentation is going to be a little bit of a couple of different things in the context of our understanding of finances. We're going to talk about the 5 steps to effective budgeting, understanding credit, retirement planning and investments, student debt management, and then we're also going to talk about a resource that's available to you at no cost at the university called iGrad. Has anybody heard of iGrad before? Yes, no in the chat? Okay, I see yes, no, got it, yes, no. All right. Perfect. Thank you so much, everybody. That's actually pretty common for us. We have a few people that have heard of it before, and we've also got a lot of people that have it. For those that haven't, this is actually a resource that the university provides to you at no cost, both now and after you leave school, that is filled with financial education resources that run the gambit of things from, like personal finances all the way to a brand new wellness and well-being section. Money mindfulness is what they call it. And I've had a chance to look at it myself. It's really fascinating. There's like journaling that you can do. They even have financial meditations in there. So it's got a really interesting gambit of things that you can utilize. Now, as we go through the presentation, I'm pretty good about checking the chat for questions. Please feel free to put them there. We also, as Antonia mentioned, have Slido available, and she had dropped that link in the chat earlier on. You can ask questions anonymously there and participate that way. We have a few places where we'll stop for questions. If I can catch questions as we go, I will. And if for some reason I don't have something that I can give you a firm answer on today, I'll either have a resource or an answer for you in the materials that you get after this session. One of the things I do like to mention, because as we go through, you'll see my slides, there's a lot of information on them. You're going to get a copy, I promise. Okay. So if you don't see something or you miss a note as you're going through, no sweat. And to go with it, you'll have my contact information. So if something's a little fuzzy for you and you want to ask questions, you can always email me at financialwellness@columbia.edu. That goes right to my inbox, and I'm very happy to help where I can. From here, though, we're actually going to get into the content of our presentation. So as Antonia mentioned, one of the things that we had the opportunity to chat about was this concept of, the dimensions of well-being. And the first, 6 seem kind of really contextualized as wellness, right? Spiritual, emotional, intellectual, physical, social, environmental. Financial often kind of feels like the odd man out or the odd girl out, the odd person out. The reason for that is we think about it often in kind of tactile terms, right? It's very statistical, analytical. However, when we think about our finances, they're tied very much to every other dimension that we see here. We certainly know that these areas can be influenced by finances in the context of whether or not we're feeling stressed. That's certainly one area. And of course, the capability to go through and do the things that we want to do in relation to these other dimensions. So what exactly is financial wellness then? Okay, if we look to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB, they suggest a definition as a state of being where you have control over your day-to-day and your month-to-month finances. You have the capacity to absorb a financial shock. You're on track to meet your financial goals, and you have the financial freedom to make the choices that allow you to enjoy life. Now, that's the one that starts to really feel like well-being and wellness, right? It's about that capability to do what you want to do and having the resources to do it. So then how do we get there? That's where financial literacy comes in, okay? I like to think of it as your path to financial wellness. It's a set of skills that encompasses knowing when and how to find reliable information to make a financial decision, knowing how to process financial information to make a sound financial decision, important, not any financial decision, just a sound one, and then knowing how to execute financial decisions, adapting as necessary to stay on track, right? So if we put these two concepts next to each other, we have knowing on the financial literacy side, and then having on the wellness side. We bridge the gap with the piece that we have on the right-hand side of our screen. In addition to that knowledge component, financial literacy has an action component. It's the ability to put your financial knowledge to use. So what we'll be talking about here today is kind of the information that's available on both sides of the conversation and how you can use it to try and bridge the gap in your actions. So then, what exactly is iGrad, right? How does that play into this? iGrad, as I mentioned before, is available to you as a resource for financial education just by being a student at the university. As you get the materials, you'll have information on how you can create your account. It's really simple. And some of the things that you'll see in iGrad include topics like money management, personal finances, credit and debt, as I mentioned, money mindfulness, consumer lending information, student aid information, and scholarship opportunities, which we'll talk about today. Just a really large plethora of different things that you can utilize. And they come in several different types of content, right? For me, I tend to like pictures. I'm one of those people. So I hang out a lot in the infographics area where iGrad has sections where you can kind of get snippets of information. And then from there, as I want to learn more, I go ahead and learn more. And I follow the additional resources that are provided. So we also have video content as well as courses and tools that you can use practically. And I always like to share with my students that these presentations are almost entirely built from the information in iGrad. So if I can know it, you can know it. These are meant to be a resource for you. Moving into the first piece of our discussion, the 5 steps to effective budgeting. Now, budgeting can be a little bit of a scary word. I know it's kind of an apprehensive thing for a lot of people, but we're going to talk about it and try and make that less so, right? When we think about budgeting, all it really is just balancing your expenses and your income, right? Seems so simple when you say it that way. However, I like to think of it more as the process of creating a spending plan, right? We want to be aware of our finances today, of course, but today isn't the end of our need in our financial life, right? We have to keep going. So we want to always have that forward focus in this conversation. And the steps that we're going to be going through include understanding needs and wants and knowing what our income and expenses are, how we can think about goal setting. Then we'll talk about spending plans in general, what they look like and what they feel like, and then how we have to assess and adjust as we move forward. Before I go on to the next slide, I do want to point out, you'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a snapshot here. This is actually from iGrad. This is one of the courses that they have available to you in iGrad related to budgeting. There's also a link to it at the bottom of the slide. This is the case for the majority of the slides that we have here today. So as you get this resource, you'll also have direct links for the information we're talking about as well. All right, so let's think about needs versus wants, right? I tend to think of this in a little bit of a different way. It's not needs versus wants, it's knowing what's important to you, right? If we look at the literal definition of needs, it's just basic things that are necessary for survival, right? However, that's really going to vary depending on who you are on any given day, and it will not be the same as the person sitting to your left or in the Zoom tile to your left or right for that matter, right? So we have to make sure that we think about that both within the context of time and our individual subjectivity, how we experience things, right? Where wants, on the other hand, are things we desire to make our lives more satisfying, okay? And that makes sense. However, if it's something that we want, we don't need it today, it means that we can plan for it. So anytime we have wants, we want to reframe them as goals. The way that we want to think about our needs, because once we start thinking about them subjectively, it can be a little hard to know what a need versus a want is. You want to look at the things that ultimately help you make all of the decisions that you make, right? Your values, your beliefs, how your attitude with money is, which is definitely something I had some learning experiences with, and then the way you behave in response to some of the conditions that are associated with your money. All of these things interact with each other, and they're all going to influence how you engage with your finances and ultimately what you think is important to you. Now, the next piece of this then is knowing our income and expenses, right? This actually is going to start to touch on some of the questions that came through a little bit before the session. So for those of you that did share questions, my goodness, this was the most engagement I've had in questions before the start of a session. So thank you so much. It was fantastic. On this slide, we're going to talk about how you can kind of better understand what your income and expenses are. And this touches on some of the tools that people were looking for budgeting purposes and understanding that information. To do that, you want to think about just a period to evaluate, whether that's 2 weeks, a month, it could be a semester, really just what makes the most sense for you. And you want to keep in mind whatever period that you're using is going to have some nuances to it, right? You want to think about if there was anything atypical that happened, whether there was an influx of funding that came in or you had a large expense, make sure that that's something you account for in your evaluation. And then from there, it's just a matter of tracking, right? The only way to really know exactly what our income and expenses are is to watch it, right? And one of the tools that's available to you in iGrad is actually a month-long tracking Excel spreadsheet. That's what you're seeing at the bottom right of the screen, okay? It's called their daily income and expense diary, and it's designed so that it's got a line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for each day of the month. It'll ask you on every given day how much money came in versus how much money went out over several different content areas. I couldn't fit the entire spreadsheet on a slide, so I did a couple of snippets for you just to show you what it looks like. At the end of it, you get something that looks kind of like what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. It's just an aggregate of the information across the month. It'll show that to you both in the context of numeric values, right? Taking everything that you've spent in and out and putting it into one place. And it'll also show that to you in the context of a pie chart, which I think is great. Again, I'm visual, that helps me. But it's both there for anybody that has one preference over the other. What's nice about just that pie chart is you can kind of see that you can figure out where you may be overspending on something or maybe didn't realize how much you were spending relatively quickly, right? In this case, it looks like this person's budget, the majority of it is in their home expenses, and that makes sense for a lot of us, right? That's usually the biggest bill that we have. We can also see that this person has a lot in insurance, right? So that might be something they look at. Do I actually need this level of insurance? Am I utilizing it? Is it really saving me money the way that I think? Or if you looked at this and you saw that you had a really big piece that was just dedicated to like fun stuff, then you might need to do some reevaluating, right? With that being said, this is really what that process looks like. You're questioning yourself. You need to look and see if all of your needs were met over the period that you evaluated, and then you want to figure out why and what can change. I do like to caution, this is just meant to be a where do I need to fix things conversation, right? Some people will find that they've done a really great job in setting money aside in one area, but maybe they're struggling in another. What can we learn from that one area and apply to the other? The bottom line is that you have to be flexible in this process, right? One of the things that came through in a couple of the questions was being prepared for kind of the changing environment that we're experiencing. The only way to do that is to make sure that you have some flexibility in the way that you approach things. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on, but be kind to yourself in this process. If you had a little bit of a hiccup somewhere, that doesn't mean that we failed. It doesn't mean we have to stop. It means we need to look at something and then look at it as a learning opportunity. And that's really what this simple budgeting worksheet, the daily income and expense diary will do. The other tool that's available, another spreadsheet, it's their simple budgeting worksheet, which is very much this kind of concept, except you're doing it for a yearly scale. It's got a little tab for each month of the year. And then at the end of the year, you can actually evaluate how things went. Perfect. And for the question that just came in, yes, we will be sharing the slides. All right. The next piece of this, now we have an idea what our income is, right? We have an idea what our expenses look like. We have to actually now set our goals, right? We've gone through and looked at what we need and what has to happen now. And we saw that we have some wants that we want to fulfill. Let's start planning for them, okay? The way to do that is to prioritize and plan within those values, resources, and needs that we talked about earlier, right? One of the things that can be challenging with goals is doing them in a meaningful way. One of the things you can utilize is called the SMART goal method. For those that haven't heard of that, it's just giving an acronym that puts some really important components of goal setting together, right? That your goals must be specific, right? If you don't have a specific goal, you're not ever going to achieve it because you don't actually know what you're trying to do. One thing, an example I should say would be, let's say you want to go on vacation. Awesome. Let's start planning for that goal. Well, I need to know where I'm going. I need to know when I plan to go. I need to know how I'm going to get there. And I need to kind of look at the resources that are available to do that, right? So we need that specificity. Measurable is also important. We can't tell if we're making progress if we can't measure progress. Attainable, this one's important. And it seems kind of, frivolous, maybe like it shouldn't be the case if it were attainable or relevant. You have to look at the tools that are available to you and make sure that your resources support what you're trying to do. We'll have something to share on that front as well. And then relevant, again, this is a goal that you want to actually pursue, not somebody else wants to pursue it for you, not something that, maybe there's some pressures going on. If it's not important to you, it's not going to be prioritized. And then the last piece is time-based. This goes along with measurable, right? If we don't give goals an end date, they're very, very easy to push off. Make it important to you. Put a goal and put a date on it. The date can change, right? That's the flexibility part of the conversation. If we need to make adjustments, make adjustments. But if we lose a date entirely, we'll never find a reason to put one back on. From here, we can start making our spending plan, okay? The big difference between a budget and spending plan, the spending plan represents your current resources and expenses, the direction your money will take, and the goals you hope to achieve. That's really that forward-thinking component I mentioned earlier, right? The first thing you'll need to do that is estimate your projected expenses versus income, right? And you want to do that as comprehensively and realistically as possible. One of the questions that came through had to do a little bit with understanding what your income might potentially be in the future in relation to some of the payments that you may have to make, whether it's student loan payments or making sure that you're setting yourself up in a good place. Some of the resources that we have here are available to do that. The first is the occupational earnings information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That can give you an idea as to what different types of employment opportunities and job fields will ultimately be earning within the context of where you might be working and what you'll be doing. The Consumer Price Index can give you information related to kind of not exactly what expenses will cost you, but how they've changed over time. Some of the questions that came in about inflation, because that is a very big topic right now, you could certainly look at that Consumer Price Index to kind of see where things have been going, where ebbs and flows are, to try and plan as you think forward. MIT actually has a living wage calculator you can look at, and that kind of has a little bit more dollar for dollar as to what things may cost in different areas. So for those that were looking for ways to kind of think about what costs in New York City might be, right? We know that that's a very different experience for a lot of us. That could be a helpful tool, as can move.org. They have utility comparisons available for different areas as well. Now, iGrad also has a plethora of tools and calculators that you can use to better understand what your money does over time. For example, the future value of investments and savings, and then also how much debt could potentially cost you over time as well. As you do this, you also want to think about all of your resources, right? You want to think about any employer benefits that you may have. There are some employers that offer assistance with repayment or even, tuition benefits for paying for school. And you also want to make sure you're thinking about some of those programs that exist to help students minimize their debt, like forgiveness programs. And I know that that's a topic that came through in a couple of different questions. And I have a slide on it, so we will definitely chat about it. But the resource that you're seeing on the screen, this is specific to some of the employment and service-based forgiveness programs that exist, so that will be available to you there. Now, we kind of have everything we need. We have our mind focusing forward. We know what our income expenses are and what we hope to do. We can start developing our spending plan, right? We want to make sure we're always looking at our current needs first, because if we don't satisfy what we need today, we're just going to compound problems tomorrow. Using our SMART goal method or a method that you have that works for you. And we want to make sure we find the right tool for us to be able to do this, right? Some of the tools I showed you before are certainly available. There's other things that exist as well. For those of us that like apps, fintech, for example, there's plenty of different options out there. If you're the type of person that my parents used this method when I was younger, and it stuck with me. It's called the back of the envelope method. Basically, you've got an envelope, you flip it over, you write what that component of your budget is, and you put the money that you have for it in the envelope. And when it's gone, it's gone. Okay. That's a very tactile way to do this. And of course, we never want to recommend that people carry large volumes of cash around, but for some people, they need that level of specificity. There's also different programs that exist out there. Just as an example, I tried to do the app-based stuff, right? And I tried a couple of different apps too. And what I found is that my phone goes off so frequently that I wasn't paying attention to the notifications that it was giving me. So I figured that wasn't the best tool for me. I needed something a little bit more intentional. So I personally use a spreadsheet for that reason. I have to sit down and give myself the time that I dedicate to my budget to look at it, review it, and go through things. Now, this is a tool that's available through iGrad that you can use for this process. This is their Your Budget tool. It's not unlike the Excel spreadsheets we were looking at before. The big difference is that this lives in the iGrad platform, okay? It's a dynamic tool. And what that means is you have the capability to make adjustments to see what will happen to your income and your expenses and your plans over time in a couple of different ways. So some of the categories that exist there, it's all the ones you'll very likely need. I mean, you can add unique categories as well, but they each have these little filter options on the end of them so that if you wanted to go ahead and adjust the amount that you have there and see what it does to your budget in real time, you can. That's what you're seeing kind of in the middle of the screen there, right? The other side of that is you can also do it in more of an aggregate way, right? If we want to adjust kind of a big portion of all of our budget, just really kind of play with it that way, you can do it in a broad scope as well. My favorite part of this tool, though, because again, forward thinking is so important, is their monthly savings and goals. What that does for you is it allows you to put a goal into your spending plan, and it'll tell you exactly based on the timeline that you've provided how much you'll need to set aside in order to achieve that goal in the time frame that you have set for yourself. What that will do for you is it'll let you know in real time whether or not what you've done is realistic, right? If we look to kind of the middle of the screen where we see monthly net, that value will change as you add and subtract figures to this information. So if you put that in and see that, we now have a red number and it's going to put us in the negative, we know that we might need to expand and take a longer time for our goal, or maybe we need to reprioritize and see if that's something we should be pursuing right now. So this is a really fantastic tool that's available if you're the type of person that likes having the capability to kind of, adjust as you go and, maybe not wanting to sit and kind of plug numbers into an Excel spreadsheet. This is a nice way to move forward. Now, arguably, the hardest part of this whole process is the last steps, just sticking to it, right? We went through the process of looking at our finances and understanding who we are, what's important to us, and trying to plan for our future based on the most current information available to us. The next thing is actually keeping that promise that we made to ourselves, what we're going to do and stick to the plan. This is that evaluating, assessing, and adjusting component, right? We want to ask ourselves, how well did we stick to the plan? Where did we struggle versus succeed? Were we reasonable in making our goals? A lot of the time when we miss goals, it's because we didn't really plan for them the way that we should have. And then what changes can and or need to be made? And I like to think of it in that context because, again, this isn't a negative experience. It's a learning experience. A great example, when the pandemic first started, I live in New Jersey and I was commuting into Manhattan, and that is expensive. So once the pandemic started, I had a surplus of money sitting there that I was just not doing anything with. And I was thinking this can't last that long. We all know different now, but I don't want to change anything. After a few months, I went, all right, this money just sitting in this account that I have which is relatively low interest is not really benefiting me. What can I do to make this work harder for me? So that's one way that you can do this in a positive way. Or if let's say you find that you're struggling somewhere, maybe there's a resource that you have in another area. Ultimately, by doing this, what you're giving yourself the power to do is kind of create self-efficacy through control, right? Now, we can't control everything, but we can prepare. We control what we can and prepare for what we can't. So when we talk about controlling stimuli, that's about where we put ourselves in our lives and the way that we understand money influences us, okay? And once we do that, we can then understand the decisions that we make surrounding our money as we evaluate things and then how we ultimately respond to things later on, right? We use the information we have and then we can control that understanding understanding of response and how the consequences that ultimately go with poor responses. And by doing that, you then have better control over your money. So it's kind of about building that self-discipline, but I also would caution you that this is a flexible process. You're going to be learning for a lot of the first couple of rounds that you do this, if you've never done it before, especially. And even if you have, coming into a new environment like Columbia, if you haven't been at the university before, it's just different. You're going to have to get a feel for kind of what that is. And that this is going to be one way that you can do that. Now, some of the tools that are available to you to kind of help with some of those challenges that exist in the budgeting process, right? First and foremost, needs versus wants and how we engage with our money. iGrad has what's called their Your Money Personality Tool. And it's just a quiz where you take a couple of very brief personality-based questions, and it gives you about a 40-page booklet report about what that means in the context of your financial decision-making. It'll let you know some of the strengths that you have and where you may have challenges, and then make recommendations on what you might choose to do in response to that. So one area that I had pointed out is I can be a bit relaxed, which means, first, it's true, absolutely true. And second, it can be that I'm a little impulsive. Absolutely the case, but it also means I'm not risk averse, which was something they shared with me there. And risk aversion has to do with this concept of whether or not you're willing to take a bigger risk with your finances. So in the context of impulsivity, they made a recommendation to try and slow down and take a beat before I buy. I am definitely an impulse shopper. If I'm having a rough day, I tend to buy things, and I found that out the hard way by evaluating my budget a long time ago. So I have to be cautious about it. In the environment of the pandemic, I found myself just ordering things constantly, right? You don't really realize how fast you're shopping in some instances when you're at home. So this was something I was able to use functionally, right? I said to myself, I'm just going to put stuff in the cart, and then I'm going to let it go for a few days, because if I'm ordering it online, I don't need it today. I had to wait at least 2 days to get it anyway. If I go back in 2 days and I don't understand why it was there, or I've satisfied what I thought I needed it for in another way, I can take it out and I haven't made the purchase. So that was a practical example of how you might use this tool. Now, one of the things that came up a lot in the questions had to do with inflation, right? And inflation is definitely a concern for a lot of people right now. There's a lot of great content that exists on iGrad right now in relation to inflation. And some of that is what you're seeing on the screen, how you can really manage your finances as inflation rises, and how you can also think about lifestyle inflation, recognizing it and how to avoid it. That's for some of the people that asked a little bit about, how do you kind of acclimate to New York City? It's one of the areas in the world where you want to engulf yourself in everything that exists within the area, right? But that can get expensive. So how do we recognize where we need to make some adjustments for that, right? We also have a resource on this slide about personal finance abroad and how to get the best exchange rate. I know that's a question that comes up a lot in relation to this inflation conversation. So my hope was to be able to provide you resources that speak to that context. In addition to that, you'll also have resources about the several different types of financial professionals that can elaborate a little further if additional questions exist. So all really great stuff for you on this front. I see questions. Oh, I'm so excited. Fantastic. So let's see what we have. Does an F1 visa PhD student have access to retirement plans like 401k or Roth IRA? That is a great question. We are going to talk a little bit about retirement plans. To answer it shortly, you can potentially have access to that, right? There's some requirements with financial institutions and the way that you approach them. However, you also want to make sure you're thinking about the context of what you'll do later on. Those types of accounts can have tax implications, right? If you're trying to take money out and bring money home. So you may want to look at speaking to a tax professional before you decide to pursue that type of option. How much money would you recommend as an emergency safety buffer? Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different targets out there. Some places say 2 months, some say 6 months, some say a year. My recommendation would be to analyze some of your finances over the last few months and seeing what exactly you've had happen, and then use that to drive the decision, right? Look at what you have and where your comfort level is in that conversation. Am I able to use iGrad after graduating from Columbia? Yes, you are. Yep. This is your account now and forever, as long as iGrad exists. So absolutely. Can I invest in US stocks and bonds that as an international student? Yep, that starts to talk a little bit about what the 401k and IRA conversation is, because those types of accounts are retirement accounts and they're built from investments. But I would also caution the exact same thing, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at the tax implications that may exist. You also want to make sure that you're looking at the types of professionals that can give you guidance in relation to any other concerns that exist there as well. How do we choose what credit cards to get? What do we need to apply for credit cards as an international student? Yeah, so credit cards are a really interesting conversation. As far as getting started with credit, there's a couple of different things you can do. There's certain types of accounts that are a little easier to obtain. For example, there's something called a secured credit card. Not that we recommend go out and get a secured credit card, but to share what it is and why it's a little easier to get. Basically, what you're doing is you're putting up collateral, whether that's, a $200 payment or, some other type of collateral, usually cash though, to say, all right, I would like this card. It's a $200 limit. Here's $200. Let me get started. Now, does that seem really helpful right away? No. But what it does is it lets you actually start to build credit. It's still your $200. You've got that collateral sitting there, but you're using the card over and over. And by doing that, you've started to build a little bit of credit. Sometimes store credit cards are a little bit easier to obtain as well, because they just have different criteria and generally lower limits. But at the same time, they can have much higher interest rates. So you want to make sure you're thinking about that with that context as well. The last question, how would you suggest starting to invest? Oh, no, I didn't mean to scroll. Sorry, guys. Let's see. I did see the question about investing. It just popped off my screen though, but just to touch on it, when would you start suggesting it? Sooner than not, right? We'll talk about that in just a few moments. Does Columbia have financial support for public transit? I'm currently waiting for public assistance, but won't process for over a month. That I actually need to look into for you. I'm not sure, but I will definitely look and share the resources that I have after the session for you. Awesome. These are great questions. Thank you so much, everybody. Now, moving on to credit, since that is actually kind of where we left off in the conversation, right? Now, credit, very simply, it's the borrowing capacity of an individual or company. We are individuals, right? However, I like to think of it more like a trust relationship because it's a really good parallel for what credit really does, right? Basically, what you're looking for is a financial institution to trust you enough to lend you money in some way, right? If we were to think about that in the context of a friendship, let's say you have a friend that you've known for a relatively long time and they ask you to borrow $100. What's the first thing that we do? We think about, all right, have I ever lent money to this person before? If so, what was the experience there? Do I know of anybody else that's done that? Did they have a problem? How long have I known this person? That's exactly the same information that goes into your credit report, the same kind of things. You're looking at your credit history, that record of trustworthiness on the way that you've utilized credit before. Typically, any type of lender, whether that's a credit card company or a long-term lender, like a mortgage lender, will evaluate credit to determine your eligibility to borrow any product that you're looking to pursue. You may be required to provide a cosigner even if you have a credit history, because again, each lender and each lending opportunity is going to have a different level that they set for their eligibility criteria. Now, very simply, how do we start building credit? You have to start using it. That's the only way to do it, unfortunately, by borrowing money and paying it off on time. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. I did see a question pop through. Is it better or worse to have multiple credit cards? That's a great question. So one of the things we're going to talk about on the next couple of slides is how your credit score is built. It's not necessarily bad to have multiple credit cards for a couple of different reasons, but at the same time, applying for things can impact your credit score. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. It's a great question. Now, that starts to talk a little bit about what we call your credit score. In this instance, your FICO or Fair Isaac Corporation credit score is a 3-digit numeric representation of the information on your credit report. So it's just a snapshot, right? And it typically ranges from 300 to 850. And very simply, the higher the score, the better your credit, right? With that being said, that's not the only thing that goes into decisions for lending opportunities, right? Sometimes we have to give them things like financial information. That's looking at something called debt to income ratio to see if, the amount of debt that you have is a concern for them to lend you more opportunity to borrow. There's also information related to other credit inquiries, which is kind of touching on some of what we talked about a moment ago, right? But for a reference point on the right-hand side of the screen, this is what you could typically expect to see as a poor, fair, good, very good, or exceptional credit score on a very general scale. You always want to make sure that if you're pursuing a specific product, that you're working with that individual financial institution to find out what their criteria are so that you're aware of that information explicitly. Now, how do we make our credit score, right? The first and foremost is your payment history, your timeliness of your payment over time. That's 35% of what comprises your overall credit score. So that's why we talk about it so fervently. If you're going to have credit, you have to pay it on time, any bill that you get, because if you don't, it can have an immediate negative impact on your score. Now, again, it's a trust relationship. It'd be great if the next time we made a payment on time, it just kind of fixed itself and course corrected. It doesn't, because we have to rebuild that trust, right? We have to get our credit history to show that we can do things the way that a lender would prefer us to by paying on time on the credit history and on our report. Okay. Now the next piece is amounts owed, excuse me. It's really just how much credit you owe in relation to the total available credit you have. Typically, you don't want that to be more than 30%. So if you have $1,000 limit on a credit card, no more than $300 on the balance that you carry. And the idea here is if you're using more than that, it could represent a risk, right? Why do we need access to every little bit of credit that we have access to? Why are we using all of it? Now, the next piece is the length of your credit history, okay? When we talk about length of credit history, it's not the first time you start using credit through now. Instead, it's the length of your oldest to newest account, okay? So this kind of touches a little bit on the question of whether or not multiple credit cards is a good idea, right? An example might be, let's say you're just starting with credit, you get your first credit card, and when that happens, you know, there's not a lot of credit history there. You might not have a really great or favorable interest rate, but you're using it so that you can start building your credit history. And then ultimately you get another card, right? And this one is, you know, got a better rate. You've been doing what you're supposed to do. One of the things that you risk by closing that older account is resetting the clock on the length of your credit history. Now, if you have a reason to close an account that's valid, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't. This only represents 15% of your overall score. But at the same time, you don't necessarily just want to close accounts to close accounts because that could potentially be an impact there. I see a question came through. So the clock only rests if you close the previous account. That is my understanding, yes. So if, let's say you have your first account and you open it today, and then 10 years from now, you open another credit account and you close the first one, you're going to be starting over. Or if you had other cards in between, your start point will go to the oldest card that's still open. You got it. Now, the last pieces of this, new credit and credit mix, each representing 10%. New credit is applying for any type of new credit line, whether that's a credit card, a loan, whatever it happens to be. This can potentially impact your score as well. And the reason for that is if you're applying for multiple types of credit all at once, it looks like you might need access to all of it, right? So that can potentially be retained on your report and make part of that decision a little more difficult for a lender. Now, there's a couple different types of inquiries in relation to credit, right? A hard inquiry, those are generally the ones that are related to eligibility to borrow. So if you're applying for a credit card or loan, those are retained on your credit report. Where a soft inquiry, those are more general reviews, whether it's something you went to review for yourself or if it was unrelated to credit eligibility explicitly. Sometimes employers check credit, for example, before you start working for them. Those are soft inquiries and those do not get retained. So whenever you're looking at applying for something, you want to make sure you understand the type of application you're completing. Another area where this applies has to do with pre-approvals and approvals for mortgages. When you do a pre-approval, a lot of the time, it's not actually that hard inquiry. They're just kind of doing a soft inquiry, a basic review. And then when you go to get the actual approval, you actually have a credit analysis that stays on the report, that hard inquiry. I see I had a question come through. Paying statement balance will keep me with a good FICO score, or do I need to pay the complete current balance? Oh, that's an excellent question. So this question talks a little bit about whether or not we need to pay the entirety of our balance in order for your credit score to be good. The general answer is no, right? As long as we are going and making on-time payment and we have our credit utilization at that 30% amount, your credit will still look good. You'll still be making that progress. However, you are carrying interest then, right? Every time that bill gets capitalized, you'll have a little bit more money that you owe at the time. So anything you can do to minimize your balances is always best in the long run. However, the on-time payment of the minimum amount due does technically maintain your credit as you go. Great question. Now, the last piece, credit mix, that's just the diversity of your credit portfolio, which sounds fancy. It's not. It's just the mix of the types of credit that you have. Unfortunately, they do not release exactly how much of what makes the best and ideal scenario here. It'd be great if they did, but the idea is you don't want to have any kind of a big basket of one item, right? Let's say all of your credit history is all credit cards. Well, those mean they're daily exchange type cards, right? With circular balances. They don't have any equity attached to them most of the time. So that's one type of debt, where a mortgage, let's say, is something that has collateral, right? So that's a different type, and it's looked at a little differently. So where you can diversify, you should. However, keep in mind, these both are only 10% of that score. So if you're looking to make big changes, the first two things we talked about, that 35% for payment history and the 30% for utilization, are the places that you'll want to do it. I see another question. Is there a way to reduce federal student loan rates below the 6.5% as refinancing destroy credit scores? Okay, that's a good question. So the way that for federal student loans in particular, one of the options that are available to you is something called consolidation, which is a lot like refinancing, except it's done through the Department of Education. It does not have a credit inquiry that goes with it, so you wouldn't necessarily have that happen. The other side of that, though, is it kind of starts the clock over, right? You're just getting a brand new loan to pay off the other one. They average your interest rates in most instances. And then from there, you have a new 10-year loan repayment period, right? So over time, you can potentially have more interest that you've paid. So just a couple of things to think about on that front. If you pay a full balance each month, then do you not accumulate interest for using the credit card? So that's a great question as well. Typically, if you have a balance that you pay in full every month, you should not have interest associated with that payment. The only time interest accrues is when you get the bill and you still have a balance after that bill comes through. Great question. Now, one of the most important things we can do in relation to credit, just to be very, very, very frank, is we have to look at it. My goodness, just like anything else. One of the things that we unfortunately have to deal with is dishonest people, and unfortunately fraud and things like that exist. So the only way to know if that's happened is to look for it, right? Good news is that anybody that utilizes credit in the US does have access to their credit report for free. It doesn't give you the score, but you get one credit report each year from each credit bureau, which are just the holders of your credit history, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. And you can do that through annualcreditreport.com. That's the official site for it. You can go elsewhere, of course. There's definitely credit monitoring that exists in other places. However, just be cautious. You want to make sure you trust the source that you're looking at. And the reason, again, that this is so important is not just in case of fraud, but errors. They happen, right? If something's not reported right, if somebody marked you to have a not on-time payment, we can, as we discussed, that can really impact your score. You want it to be accurately representative of what the work is that you're doing. To go with this particular slide, I also wanted to make sure that I gave some really good information to some of the terms that you see on credit-based applications, because they can get a little heavy. That's what you have at the bottom left of the screen. And there's also really great information here about how you can start to build credit for those of us that are looking to do that at the onset, or maybe rebuild our credit from previous transactions. All right, so I see we had some questions pop through. Oh my gosh. You guys are great. I can't get over all of these questions. Let's see. I'm going to focus on the credit ones for now. One question, can high student loan debt impact your ability to be approved for a credit card? That's a fantastic question. So student loan debt isn't looked at exactly the same way as other types of debt. Again, it's valued a little differently because it's not collateral based, but it does have your education attached to it. It's got purpose and function. So of course, any type of debt that you have can be utilized in determining your eligibility for a product, but it might not necessarily be as restrictive as it would otherwise for, let's say, just a traditional loan. How many credit cards would you suggest having? So it's a tough question. That's a really personal question. It's going to depend on your individual needs. I would recommend start off with getting, the one, and then see what it does for you, right? If it's meeting the needs that you have, are you functionally building credit the way that you'd like to? You may also want to consider some of the rewards that exist with other cards, right? For some types of cards, as your credit improves, you might potentially get cashback opportunities, or you could potentially have like a gas card that's good for a certain type of gas company where you need to make that purchase. So it's really, really, really going to depend on what your needs are. Let's see. Does it mean if I do not plan to have any credit cards or loan borrowings, I'll never get a credit score? Fantastic question. And unfortunately, yes. For a lot of people, they think I'm just not going to use credit. which is great in the moment of what you're doing. Unfortunately, the first time you ever try to use it, it'll be like you're an 18-year-old person using it for the first time, right? So unfortunately, unless you've got another avenue for showing information on a credit score, one way you could maybe do that. There are certain rental companies that they'll give you a chance to report to a credit bureau. That's not frequent though, it's not guaranteed, but that could be one way to do it. But I would definitely say that if you're not going to, get a credit card or use some type of lending opportunity at some point, then unfortunately you won't have that credit history being built. Let's see, when you sign up for utilities or cell phone plan, they check your credit. Yeah, so that's a good point as well. When we talk about that credit component, a lot of utility companies will check your credit as part of the application. Now, again, that might not be the same as trying to apply for a credit card or a loan because it's for a different function, right? But they could potentially look at it. So that's another reason to not advocate for using a credit card, but to think about using your capability to exercise good credit history. Awesome questions, everybody. In the interest of time, I'm going to move forward. And for any question that we can't get to today, I will absolutely make sure that we answer it because you guys are asking such wonderful questions. I don't want to limit anybody on time. But I do want to make sure we touch a little bit on this next topic, which is investments in retirement planning. So a very basic question. We have two scenarios, right? A $10,000 initial deposit at 100% returns. Now, that's not real. This is just for math. It's easy. And we're going to get that for 10 years. Versus $10,000 at 10% returns for 100 years. Which do we think is the one that we'd want to pursue, right? If we were to go with the first option, we have $10,240,000. That's what we will have made in that 10-year span. However, if we use our 10% option over 100 years, we're at $137,806,123.40. To say the difference isn't significant is just unreal, right? That's a big, big difference. And are these numbers we're ever actually going to work with? No. But what it illustrates to you is the value of time, right? It can be really, really easy to kind of go for the immediate attractiveness of that 100% return rate over 10 years. However, staying in it for the long haul gives you an opportunity to actually, see that money grow. And I do see somebody pointed out, I don't think that many of us will be alive in 100 years to enjoy that. You're 100% right. And this is just to show you kind of on a larger scale why it's important to think about the way that we invest and plan for retirement in the context of time, right? We want to make sure that we're doing things as early as we can, because the longer our money is doing what we want it to, the longer it has to grow. And that's called compound interest. Now, in order to do that, we need to know how much we need to retire. A good rule of thumb is about 70 to 80% of the salary we had while working, with the intention of taking about 4% of that total each year that we are in retirement, if we're retiring at 65. However, this is something, again, that's a rule of thumb, which means it's very generalized. We're all going to be in different circumstances and look for different things. My significant other, for example, he's hoping to retire in Vermont in a cabin and fish his days away. I haven't said we're doing that yet, but that's the conversation. He's not going to need 70 to 80% of his income. We live in a much higher cost area than Vermont, right? In New Jersey. And the type of housing he's looking for is very different. So that's not going to be a realistic projection for him. However, this is a good place to start, something to think about as you're kind of making plans. You want to make sure you've got a goal in mind, right? You want to think about that anticipated lifestyle, the other sources of income you may have, your debts, and any future expenses. A great example here, as we get older, our medical costs usually get more expensive, and we don't always think about that in the moment of today. So you want to make sure you account for that. You also want to keep inflation in mind. Now, a year ago, that's not necessarily what was a non-focus for people. I know it is today, but inflation is going to still happen over time, right? The value of our dollar is not going to be exactly the same now as it was then, and things are just going to cost more. So you want to think about that as well. Now, iGrad has something called a retirement analyzer tool. And what it does is it asks you some basic questions about what you currently have contributed to your retirement and what your plans are. And based on that information, it lets you know whether or not you're on or off track. And if you're not on track, what you might do to get there. Okay. So that's a really fantastic tool that's actually listed in the resources at the bottom of this slide. I would highly recommend using it. Now, there's a few different types of retirement accounts, and this kind of touches on some of the questions that came through as well. Some of them had to do with whether or not we should be looking at putting money in maybe what's called an individual retirement account, an IRA versus savings account. That's going to come down to what we call liquidity, right? How how fast do you need to access the money that we're talking about? These types of retirement investment opportunities that go into 401ks and individual retirement accounts, they are investments. They're long haul type things, right? You can't necessarily access your 401k or IRA immediately when you need it. So it's something that you want to think about in the context of where you place your funding. Now, for both 401ks and individual retirement accounts, they're just retirement plans. The big difference, a 401k is typically offered by an employer, where an individual retirement account is something an individual pursues. There's two different types of each. We have both traditional and Roth for each type of account. And traditional accounts just mean that the contributions that you make to it are pre-tax, and any earnings from the 401k investments are not taxed until they're withdrawn. So that's just to kind of give you the context that when you go to get the money later on, that's when you owe the tax on it, okay? Where a Roth account, whether it's 401k or IRA, they're very similar, but that big difference is when you pay the tax on it, right? So instead of it being a pre-tax contribution, you're doing it from your gross income, which means that the income earned on the account from interest, dividends, or capital gains is tax-free. That long-term bit, that's not when you're paying the taxes. So that's going to be a different decision for everybody, depending on what you might choose. You want to think about the income that you're going to have later, of course, and what you have now. There's some really great comparison charts available on the IRS's website to see a little bit more nuances on the differences here. And I'll make sure I share that with you. And I'm also going to have information about the types of financial professionals that can start to answer a little bit more of the nuanced questions within the context of your specific circumstances. Now, to touch on a few other types of retirement plans very quickly, we have a 403b, a KEOGH plan, and Social Security. 403b is very much like a 401k. The big difference is that this is something that's explicit to certain types of employers, like nonprofits. A KEOGH plan is actually a pension plan. And we don't necessarily see a whole lot of pensions around anymore, but they do exist. And basically, it's another type of retirement account that can be set up in two different ways, whether it's defined benefit or defined contribution. Defined benefit, what that really means is the amount that you get later on is not explicit to the amount that either you or the people contributing for you at the onset. You are getting a periodic amount later on that does not have to do with what you did first. Where defined contribution is everything else that we've talked about. The amount of money that you put in ultimately results in a change in the amount that you get later on. Now, Social Security, this is something that's available to those that have contributed to Social Security benefits through their FICA taxes. That's something that you pay when you get your paycheck. For anybody that's gotten a paycheck in the U.S., basically you're thinking you're going to get one amount and you get a much smaller amount later on, which is unfortunate, but it's because we're paying for things like Social Security, and that's something that can be available to you later on for retirement. However, you don't want to count on it, right? It's not necessarily something that is meant to be a sole contributor for your retirement. It's supplemental. You want to make sure you're utilizing the options that are available. Now, the way that these are built, right, we're going to start talking a little bit about investments here. There's three different asset categories or types of investments that ultimately go into what builds your retirement account. The first is cash or cash equivalents. They play it safe type funds. They're assets that are highly liquid, meaning you can get to that money pretty much whenever you need it. However, that also means there's not a lot of risk involved, right? And low risk typically means low return. So we typically see lower interest rates on these. Where fixed income assets are your middle ground assets, right? They offer predictable return at predictable time. These are usually something that kind of would be called in the middle, like a certificate of deposit or a bond. They don't have as much of a risk as far as time goes because they have, time allocations, but not necessarily the inability to access it quickly. A good example of what that would be, maybe your home. If you're looking at it as an investment asset, right? You can't sell a home really fast. And then lastly, we have equity assets, your out on a limb funds. These are typically what people think about when we think about investing, whether they're stocks or things like stocks, like exchange traded funds. These are typically riskier than fixed income assets or the cash equivalents we talked about because they can fluctuate in value, whether that's up, zero, or negative, which means they can produce variable income. With that said, this is kind of some of the ways that you can think about that and how you protect for it. The idea is you want to go and look for something called diversification. And that just means, again, not putting all your eggs in one basket, having some cash equivalent stuff, having some of the riskier stuff, having the stuff in the middle, and having different types of investments. So depending on how it ultimately adjusted, well, you want to make sure that, as things go through, that you're still not putting all of those eggs in a place where if something went terribly wrong, you ultimately, have a problem and don't have all the funds that you thought you did. Now, I saw we had another question come through. Could you clarify the distinction between the pension account and retirement account? Yes, I absolutely can. With that being said, I do know that we're close to time, and I want to make sure that I'm mindful of everybody's time. So before I answer that question, what I would like to do, and Antonia, if this is okay with you, I'd like to go ahead and see if I can finish up this presentation, record it at the tail end of the day for you, and send it out with the materials that we have so that you're getting the information that we didn't have a chance to get to. You guys had such wonderful questions. Wanted to make sure we answered them. Would that be okay, Antonia?
That is amazing. Thank you so much for offering. Yes.
Yeah, no, not at all. It's important to me that you guys get the information. So I'm going to go ahead just to the tail end of our presentation for that reason, because I want to make sure I give you my contact information for anybody that needs to step out. Some of what you will be getting as we go forward includes how to use iGrad. It also includes resources on some of the questions that we haven't touched on yet that came through. That'll be available to you, as well as the public service loan forgiveness and some of the debt relief programs that are out now that are being prepared for. I know that was a question that came through. That link for Slido is also still open. It will be open. So if you have questions after the session today, please feel free to use it, ask. With that being said, again, I apologize at the time, but I'm glad for why. You guys had such wonderful questions, and I want to make sure I get to all of the content. So thank you for everything. And Antonia, if I could pass it on to you.
Thank you so much for this. This was wonderful. And I will be sending out the recording and any related materials to you all and everyone that participated and signed up for this. So thank you all so much for coming. We are mindful of time. Thank you for thinking about your well-being. We hope you have a wonderful day and see you soon.
Hello again, everybody. First and foremost, thank you to everybody who is reviewing this video. I know that we had a little bit of a time crunch at the end of our session, and I wanted to make sure I had a chance to go back and talk about the points that we were planning on talking about and didn't have the opportunity to get to. To get us back on track, I know the last thing that we kind of touched on had to do with the question between the difference between traditional and Roth IRAs. So I thought, why not start there? When we talk about traditional versus Roth, traditional really just means that the contributions that you're making happen in a pre-tax capacity. So when you get your paycheck, typically we have the gross pay, what we actually are expecting we're earning. Then there's certain obligations related to, tax liability and government programs that ultimately comes out of that. And then the bottom of that is actually the net pay that you receive. What they do with traditional 401ks is they deduct the amount from your gross pay. And that means that you're not paying any tax on it right now, because that is not subject to the taxes that come out after you ultimately get your paycheck. Now, Roth, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. Instead of it coming from that gross amount, they actually deduct it from the net amount. So that means you're technically paying tax on it now, and you won't have to do that later. When we think about this in the context of what somebody may or may not do, of course, we can't say which is going to be the best for you, but there's some tax liabilities in relation to the type of income that you earn and how much you're earning that may influence that decision. So we're going to have, as I mentioned throughout the presentation, a couple of different resources for you in relation to the types of professionals that can assist with that. And as I also noted, there's a comparison chart here, so you can kind of look at the difference between the two as well. From here, though, I'm going to go ahead and step back to where we left off otherwise. We talked a little bit about the type of investments here as far as what goes into your actual retirement plan. I'm going to touch on it again because we were, again, getting a little close to time, and I want to make sure that we touched on it enough for everybody. The way that a retirement plan is ultimately built is from a portfolio of investments, meaning there's a couple of different types of investments that go into it, and there's a couple different ways that you can ultimately decide to do that. The biggest thing that you want to make sure of is that you're not putting what we would say is all your eggs in one basket, meaning having only one type of investment or a subset of investments that are all kind of classified the same way. And when we say classified, that's what we're talking about with asset classes. They're investments with similar characteristics. Now, the first type we'll talk about, these are cash or cash equivalents. They're typically thought of as your play it safe type of investments. They're assets that are highly liquid, and all that really means is that you can access it quickly if you need to, and they can readily be converted to cash. So that typically means that they're very low risk, right? There's not a lot of a risk as far as not getting your money back on that investment, and you have access to it at all times. This is typically your average checking or savings account, as well as some of the other examples that they have listed here on the screen. Now, the benefit of this is you can get to the funds, right? However, low risk typically means low return. This is why we tend to see such low interest rates on things like savings accounts, or no interest rates often on checking accounts. So just something to kind of think of in the context of the way that these work. Now, fixed income, these are your middle ground, a little bit more risky than what we just spoke about, but not necessarily riskiest, if that makes sense. They offer a predictable return at a predictable time. And basically what you're doing is lending money to a government or company in exchange for guaranteed periodic income payments, the return of your principal, plus a portion of interest earned at a certain future date. The most common retail kind of analogy, that I can make in respect to this would be certificates of deposit, or a CD. And if you're not familiar with those, the way that they work is they're typically offered by your average financial institution, where you would get a checking account or savings account. But instead of it being an account that you have a lot of access to, it has a time component to it. Typically, they require you provide a certain amount of funding over a certain period of time for a guaranteed rate of return. Where the risk comes in is you don't have access to your funds, or if you have to take the funds out earlier than the term that you applied for and ultimately agreed to, you don't get the benefit of the money that's been earned on it. So we can kind of see how risk works within the time context on that conversation. Okay, for this reason, they tend to lead to slow and steady growth. Now, the last one, this is going to be equity assets. These are your out on a limb assets. And again, I think I mentioned in the first piece of the recap that we had that these are typically what you think of when you hear stocks and when you hear investing, right? They include stocks, exchange traded funds, ETFs, financial contracts such as options, futures, and derivatives. The simplest way to think of it is that they're securities in which the holder has equity in a company or other account. The reason that they're seen as riskier than fixed income assets and cash equivalents is because they can fluctuate in value. And that typically doesn't mean they can only fluctuate down to zero, right? You can actually lose your principal on these types of investments. So the type of variable income you can earn also falls into the loss category. Now, with that being said, because they're riskier, there's typically a chance for, a little bit higher return, right? So that's the trade-off. The reason that knowing these is important, one, is in the context of just understanding what goes into an investment portfolio, right? And some of the considerations. But the other side of that is when you build your retirement funding, you want to make sure that you've got some extra, cushion in there, that you're protecting yourself as much as you can within the capability to do so. And that's where we have this next piece of information come in, okay? A couple of different terms and resources that are important in this context. So first and foremost, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to have an asset allocation, what diversification is, and what rebalancing is. Your asset allocation is dividing an investment portfolio, such as the one in your retirement plan, among different asset classes or categories, making sure you've got something from, the low risk, medium risk, and high risk group, right? By doing that, you're practicing a technique called diversification, which is just allocating investments across a variety of assets. Now, to give an example as to why that's important, if we were to look at the right-hand side of the screen, we can see that this is an asset allocation that's pretty well diversified. This person has 63.26% in U.S. equity. That's, pretty high, all the way down to 0.19 in short-term investments, other assets, and liabilities. And this is actually something that you could see in potentially a retirement account, okay? Now, this is important to look at because if we see behind it, there's this pie chart that shows how much of everything is in this asset allocation. Over time, let's say U.S. equities has a really good year, right? And you earn a lot of funds as a result. That pie chart's going to change. You're going to see the blue in that pie chart get significantly larger, which means the percentage that you have is no longer what you ultimately wanted in the first place, right? This is why we do something called rebalancing, going back in and looking at it and making sure that that asset allocation that you set up rather intentionally looks the way that you want it to and that you're not overloaded in one area. The reason that's important, let's say the second year we are looking at this portfolio, US equity did not do nearly as well and we didn't rebalance, we'll see that we have some loss opportunity there, okay? Now, one of the questions that came through that I didn't have an opportunity to answer was kind of thinking about where you might first start learning to invest. Of course, we can't make recommendations on what you should do explicitly, but for many people, choosing your retirement investments can be a place to start. If you aren't currently participating in a plan that's available to you through your employer, as we noted, the sooner you start, the better, because it gives you more time to earn money on the money that you're putting in, and then money on the money it earns. So that may be a really good place to get an idea for the way that investing works. On top of that, you typically have advisors that you can work with, regardless of what type of retirement plan you're using. The institution that offers it will usually have somebody there that can answer basic questions for you. They are typically employed by that organization, so you want to keep that in mind. However, they're there to assist you with better understanding what the information that you're looking at is. I know we had a couple of questions come through in relation to cryptocurrency as well, and to be very honest, it's not an area I have a lot of expertise. However, I am including resources related to cryptocurrency and blockchain that are available through iGrad, so this way you can take a little bit more of an opportunity to look at that information to get an idea as to how it might answer the questions that you shared. Now, I wanted to take an opportunity to really think about interest in a couple of different ways, right? Interest, much like that high risk category we talked about in investing, it's not just interest you can earn, it's interest you can be charged, right? What we're looking at on the screen is an example actually from iGrad related to compound interest, whether you choose to pay a credit card versus put money aside in a bank account, right? That's a very common question. Should I pay down my debt or should I start saving? If we were to look at this example on the left-hand side of the screen, this person ultimately decided to pay their credit card. Now, with that in mind, this example is putting zero payment toward the credit card. That's not perfect, right? But it was for simple math. The important parts of this, right? If we look first and foremost, the interest earned, their annual percentage rate on that particular savings account is 0.85%. It's important to know. And over a period of 6 years, our balance starting at zero, putting $500 a month away, gave us $3,090.56. However, we also have our credit card, right? Now, again, this is indicating there were no payments made, but typically you'd be required to pay at least the minimum amount that's there. But for simple math, this is the example. We can see that by doing kind of that concept, you've actually seen your balance go up from the original, let's say 3,000 that it was in this example, to 6,126.09 cents. So ultimately, you've lost $35.53 on a net calculation, right? Now, this person with that $500 and what they choose to do with it ultimately decides instead, let's just pay our credit card, right? So this is now, we can see that 13% interest. It's the same credit card example that we had here. And not only did we see that their balance went down, they had a net gain of $1,456.48. So even though it doesn't necessarily feel like you're putting money aside, you're giving yourself the benefit of having paid more towards that debt. Now, this doesn't mean you're always going to want to do that. It's a very individual decision. This is just to show you how you might choose to consider a couple of different things in which decision you decide ultimately to make. Now, stepping into our next topic, and I know there were a lot of questions surrounding this, talking a little bit about how you can think about debt in the context of your school expenses and how you really budget for that and minimize it. The best way ultimately to reduce student indebtedness is just to minimize it. But you need to know how much you may need to borrow if that's the case, right? Ultimately, the same thing we talked about in the budgeting section of our presentation can be done within the context of your student experience, right? We can look at budgeting to determine if we need additional assistance beyond the financial aid award that we have to support ourselves during academic study. As we noted, you do want to have accurate projections to do that. There's something available through either your financial aid office or your financial aid office's website called your cost of attendance. And we'll talk about what that is in just a moment. You also can look at a couple of different ways to maybe just not borrow as much as you would otherwise, in that we have some alternate payment options like a monthly payment plan, which has no interest associated with it, and to look at some of the resources that you already have. After going through that budgeting process and evaluating our income and expenses, we may find that we've got a little bit more money than we thought we did, making some adjustments, right? How can we ultimately use that to our best benefit? Like the example I mentioned with the pandemic and having some extra money because I wasn't commuting. Now, you also want to look for non-repayable alternatives to student loans first. The most common one that people think of is scholarship opportunities. With that said, there's a lot of places that you can look for scholarships. You want to make sure you trust the sources that you're looking at. And one of the ways you can kind of think of it is if they're asking you to pay for something, it's not somewhere you want to be. Okay, so never pay for those types of services. Now, if you do find that you've been awarded some additional funding, like scholarship funds, first and foremost, you don't have to do that before you start school, right? You still can do that as a continuing student, but in either case, you want to make sure you notify the financial aid office of any funding that you have received. It doesn't help to reduce your debt if we don't know that you received it. So letting us know helps us adjust your packaging. With this, there's going to be a few resources I share with you, including definitions of different types of non-repayable fund sources, and also some direct links on where you can look for some of those opportunities. In addition to that, I'm going to show you a iGrad scholarship search engine in just a few slides, which is fantastic for looking for opportunities as well. Continuing on though, and kind of thinking about the context of cost of attendance and what that really means and how we can use it to our benefit. Cost of attendance is really just a representation of the amount a student may reasonably expect to pay for school over an established period. Typically, it's a year, but you may also see it as a term as well. You might hear it called your COA or your budget. And as I noted, there's an academic year version and there's a term-specific version. And it includes what we call direct and indirect costs. Now, direct costs, those are what you typically think of as your school expenses. They're generally what the school is charging you, your tuition and your school-related fees. Now, indirect costs, those are things that aren't explicitly going to be charged by the school necessarily. They may be, some of them, things like room and board if you're paying to the university, but not always, right? Not all of us do that, but it is important to have these things in order to be able to attend school. Really important. This includes things like your room and board if you're not living on campus or using a meal plan. It'll include things like medical insurance, transportation, personal expenses. The idea here is that this is information provided to you by the university that kind of represents what your costs may look like while you're in attendance. That's why I put in the middle of the screen some of the key items that you might include in your budget. If we compare that to the budget information on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see there's a lot of overlap. We have housing in both sections. Our utilities are accounted for in room and board, transportation, food is, important as well, medical insurance, and then telecommunications. Those are all things that fall within the context of what we put into your cost of attendance. So that's why it works really well as an opportunity to build accurate projections. Now, if you cannot find that information for some reason, typically it will be on your school's financial aid website. But if that's something you're having difficulty finding, you can always get in touch with the financial aid office as well, and they can provide that to you. As I mentioned, iGrad has a really nice scholarship search engine. The reason I like it is that it's not just a scholarship search engine that's going to take you to websites where you might find, information that's no longer valid or things that aren't necessarily important to you. This is a monitored opportunity to look for applicable scholarships that are available now, and knowing that the information is current. iGrad maintains this and actually goes in and monitors and gives you the opportunity to look for funding that makes the most sense for you. As you can see on the screen, they give you the chance to kind of sort this in a way that makes sense for you, whether you're looking for the things that end soonest, meaning that their deadline is coming up, or the highest dollar amount. You also have the opportunity to save these opportunities, but my favorite part is when you click on any given opportunity, it opens up the information about that scholarship right there. You don't get taken directly to the website of the place where you're hoping to apply unless you choose to go there by clicking apply. This lets you take the opportunity to look at a lot of different scholarships in one place without having to go to a bunch of different places and see if it's something that you really want to do, to read the descriptions. You can kind of do that all right through the iGrad tool. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there's also a lot of other ways you might choose to filter this information, whether it's by grade level or school type, let's say graduate versus undergraduate. And we also have the capability to filter for citizenship requirements, whether or not citizenship is required or if not required, or not indicating that it's required, which can be really helpful for our international students. So this is, again, a resource that's available to you through iGrad. It'll be included with the materials that I send. It'll have a link to that particular resource, and I strongly encourage you to take a peek there. Now, let's say we go through the process of looking at our income and expenses, just like we would when we were doing our initial spending plan, and we come up with some accurate projections using that cost of attendance, and we see that we just aren't going to be able to live in a way that's reasonable. given what we have available in our own context. We may be looking at borrowing some type of student loan. Now, when we talk about student loans, there's a couple of different things that are important to realize. There's different types. First and foremost, we have federal loans, which are offered by the Department of Education to eligible students. And then we have private loans, which is maintained as a consumer product, right? It's kind of like going to your local bank and getting a loan, except these are explicit for education purposes. Now, as far as being eligible for federal student loans, they typically do not require a credit check. There's one exception, which is Graduate Plus loans. However, there's other eligibility criteria that apply, right? You have to complete the free application for federal student aid or your FAFSA each year. And they have criteria related to citizenship and residency, along with a few other things. So there's that set of criteria that you need to be aware of there. Private loans, on the other hand, they establish eligibility very uniquely. Every financial institution is going to have their own criteria, and they may even have different criteria in each product that they offer. So what you want to make sure you do in those instances is read all of the terms and conditions that are available to you in advance of making the application. Now, interest rates for these, for federal student loans, they're currently offered at a fixed interest rate based on the date that a loan's first dispersed or sent to the school on your behalf. Where private loans, on the other hand, those interest rates are going to vary. And when I say vary, it's not necessarily variable interest rates. It could be, which just means that they fluctuate over time. And you'll see that when you apply, that it'll indicate that it's a variable interest rate. A lot of them do offer fixed interest rates as well, but the interest rate that you get is going to depend on the financial institution, the people applying, yourself, and if you have a co-borrower or co-signer, the individual products terms and conditions, and other factors is decided by the lending institution. So the only way to know the interest rate is to, one, see the terms that are available. They'll typically give you a range that lets you know what the rate may fall in. And then if you decide to apply for it, reading the terms and conditions explicitly to your opportunity to borrow. Now, as far as repayment options for these go, federal student loans have several entitled repayment options, which means as long as you're a borrower in good standing, you have access to them and the capability to change them. Those payment plans kind of start at what they call standard, which is a fixed amount over 10 years. However, there are several different options if that payment is not reasonable within the context of the funding that you have when you're getting into a point of repayment. Where private loans, they may or may not offer alternative repayment options beyond what you've ultimately signed for in your loan documents. It's going to vary on each independent lender. And it also could vary based on the conditions, right? We did see some private lenders have a period where they offered payment relief during the pandemic, for example, and that may not have been accounted for in the actual terms and conditions that were made available. They did it to support their borrowers in a time of need, right? Now, again, you can't rely on anything like that if it's not in your terms and conditions. You have to make sure you read those documents, but keeping in mind, you can always get in touch with these private lenders in advance so you can, speak with them and better understand what exactly they're offering as far as these loan products go. Now, the most important thing after we talk about, really minimizing the amount that we borrow is to track how much you borrow. When we think about student loans, whether they're private or federal, they're not in front of us, right? It's like using a credit card. It's like any other type of opportunity you have where your money goes from one area to another in the ether, so to speak. For that reason, it's really easy to find yourself in a place where you're borrowing far more than you initially anticipated, right? For federal student loans, you can monitor that information through your student aid summary, or which is just basically an aggregate of your information at the website studentaid.gov. You can log into that using the same FSA ID or Federal Student Aid ID that you use when you do your free application for federal student aid. And the nice thing is you actually can import that data into iGrad as well. They'll have a little ticker with the information across the main page for you. So it's kind of a nice reminder, and every few months it'll say, hey, you probably should update this, which is a kind of a forced reaction to go and look at that loan information, right? It's a nice prompt. In addition to that, studentaid.gov has what they call their federal student loan simulator. What it does is it takes your current student aid summary information and allows you to add future borrowing if you'd like to. So if you plan on borrowing in the future, you can get an idea as to what those payments may ultimately be later on. And it'll do that across several different repayment options, including options like that standard plan that I mentioned, across several different income-driven repayment plans, which kind of look at your income and what they call your discretionary income to determine your affordability based on on the documents you share for applying for it. And it'll even give you information about public service loan forgiveness in the event that you qualify. Having the information shared with you as an estimate does not mean that you qualify, but I have information in these slides as well where you can learn a little bit more about those programs and if you could potentially qualify. Now, for private loans, unfortunately, there's no aggregate database for private student loans. Each individual servicer very likely has their own website where you can monitor information in relation to the loans that you borrowed. However, you don't want to rely on it explicitly because if for some reason, let's say you're only using one lender, somebody else might do something disingenuous and borrow something in your behalf. You won't know that if it's through a lender that is not the one that you're currently utilizing. The only way to see everything is to look at your credit report, as we mentioned in the credit section. Now, with that said, you definitely can still use your lender or your servicer's website. It's a really great tool that's there for you for communicating with them, but you want to make sure you check that credit report every once in a while to be sure that everything is doing what you expect it to. Now, some of the questions that we received were in relation to the recently announced student loan debt relief program through the Department of Education and Federal Student Aid. While we can't ultimately express your eligibility for this program because there's still a lot of factors out there that just haven't been fully announced, we can share where you can find the most current information in relation to this program and how you can stay up to date. Ultimately, what the program is a one-time student loan debt relief option that's targeted to low and middle income families that was announced on August 24th. What you can ultimately do now until we have more details, you can get prepared for when it happens, right? You can log into your studentaid.gov account and make sure that your contact information is current for any outreach that may be coming from the Department of Education. If you're having trouble getting logged in, you can go ahead and either create or reset your FSA ID, and the website to do that is here. You have the capability to sign up for text alerts if you'd like to receive them. That's a nice way to make sure you're getting the information, but emails will also be sent. And you also want to make sure that your servicer has up-to-date contact information for you as well. Now, basically what a servicer is, it's the person that, the organization that kind of does the administrative work on your federal student loan, okay? This program, to make sure I'm explicit about it, is very much tied to only federal student loans. And when you go to the websites that are listed here, they have more details about which federal student loans will be eligible and what the different types of eligibility look like. The links that I have here for you include the FAQ page from the Federal Student Aid announcement, as well as FAQs in relation to the debt relief details that were provided. And I also have a website where you can sign up for federal student loan updates. We've been given guidance that the Department of Education will be providing updates through the listserv that's linked there. So I strongly recommend logging in and signing up for those subscriptions. Now, as far as getting help, one of the things that we do want to make sure we share with you is that right now, everything that's on the websites through Federal Student Aid and the Department of Education is the most information available through any resource you might contact with Federal Student Aid. So giving the call to their number is certainly, absolutely acceptable. However, you're probably not going to get anything beyond what you can read on the website. So right now, those are your best resources. After the application for this goes live, we do know that there will be an application that goes with this, though we aren't sure who is going to need to do it or not. The phone number for getting additional support is provided on the screen for you as well. We also had some questions related to just student loan forgiveness in general and repayment of federal student loans. Some of the information on this slide is meant to help you look at a couple of different things. One, where you can see what your federal student loan debt looks like. That's the studentaid.gov website that I mentioned, as well as there's resources here, including the Federal Student Loan Simulator, which can show you the repayment options that you have with a little bit more of an estimate of what it would be in several different repayment options that are available. The different repayment options with specific details are linked on this screen as well, so you can read a little bit more about each and the way that they're calculated as far as what your estimated monthly payment might be. We also got information in the questions related to just how do I ultimately, make sure I'm paying this in a way that is the least expensive, right? That you're on time and that you're doing it to your benefit. Studentaid.gov has a lot of really good information on their how to pay your loan faster section on making sure that you can do that if that's where your interest is. Now, on top of that, we also have information here in the event that you're ever having kind of interim trouble making payments, right? There's a few temporary relief options that are generally available on the federal student loan side as well. And then talking about loan forgiveness, there's information here for several different resources. The first on the top right of the screen is the Public Service Loan Forgiveness website for federal student loans, which includes information about their help tool, which kind of lets you simulate what doing the application looks like and whether or not you're eligible. And they also have an employer search because that particular program is tied to explicit types of employment, typically nonprofit employment. So you can take a look to see if your employer is listed there. There's also some information here related to temporary public service loan forgiveness. That's a unique waiver program that's currently in place through the end of October. For people that had applied maybe for forgiveness before and ultimately just didn't meet one of the small criteria that went with it, they're giving those people the opportunity to try and get forgiveness again if they had some type of error on an application or didn't qualify. So if that's ever happened to you, that's where you can go through that, okay? And I know we had questions about teacher loan forgiveness as well. There's the resource on this screen that you can look at and take a peek at and get, the parameters for the qualifications there. And the last one at the bottom left of the screen, this isn't a federal resource. However, it's offered by TISLA, which is a nonprofit organization that assists student loan borrowers. Not that we recommend, one entity over another. Studentaid.gov is the place to go for your federal student loans, but they do have a search tool that you can utilize to look at different types of forgiveness programs that may fall outside the context of the federal ones, whether it's profession related or potentially directly to the state that you're located in. One of the other areas that we had some questions on was related to just understanding, basics about financial institutions and how to ultimately make a decision about which one you might pursue for some of your basic needs, like checking and savings accounts and the requirements for that. These resources are going to be really helpful on that front. First, on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a checklist that's available from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau related to opening your first checking or savings account, whether it's through a traditional bank or a credit union, and they're very similar as far as how they work. It's a really nice checklist. It'll talk about whether or not you need certain documents. I know one of the common questions we get from our international students is, do I need to have, a social security number? Not necessarily. And the ISSO office has a really great resource on some of the things that students have utilized in the past to get their bank accounts. And on the left-hand side of the screen, because we're not financial advisors, I wanted to make sure that I included a couple of resources for where you can get additional information beyond what we can share with you. So, for example, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA, has information about checking into brokers related to investments and whether or not they're certified, licensed as applicable. The Financial Planning Association also has information about financial planning experts that are there and whether or not they're certified, as well as the CFP board. It's the same thing. And the IRS has some really great resources on how you can look for the type of tax professionals that you may need as well. So these are all really great opportunities to learn a little bit more on that front. Now, this is a resource I wanted to share in the context of some of the questions we got on, just where we can get more information, right? This is actually iGrad's topic hub, and this is every topic that iGrad has aggregated as far as information available in the platform. And when I say all of it, not everything that's on the screen, all of it is going to be even more encompassing than this. I couldn't fit all of it on here, but these were some of the areas that I thought you might have the most benefit from. And these are linked for you as well. So there's a section on banking, spending less, saving for goals, credit, managing debt, building an emergency fund, how you can go about that. There's a whole new section on cryptocurrency and technology for those of us that had questions about, what apps we might use. So I strongly recommend visiting this. And when you choose any given category from that website, it'll give you all the content and available resources in iGrad on that topic. So it's a really nice place to look for just a big aggregate of information. So we talked a lot about iGrad today. The reason we do that is because the vast majority of these presentations are built from iGrad, and it's a resource that's available to you. When you create your account, which to do that, all you need is your @columbia.edu email address, and it's available to all of the Columbia community with the exception of our affiliates. This is ultimately what you'll see when you get logged in. You'll see this is your main web page. There's information related on doing your financial checkup. And this is actually a unique component within iGrad. iGrad aims to customize information to you, meaning that they ask you to do this checkup every once in a while so that the recommended content that they provide ultimately makes the most sense for you, given where you are in life at that time. Towards the bottom of the screen, you can also see that there's a little section that says your student loans. This is the ticker I mentioned when we talked about bringing your loan information into iGrad from from the Federal Student Aid website, it actually puts it right on the main page for you so you can see it. It's just making sure you're aware of it. And when it's time to go ahead and update the information, it normally has a little red ticker around it. It goes, hey, you should be looking here. Okay. There's also a section that takes you to all the different courses that are available in iGrad. Right now, there's 25 of them. They're always adding more, so it could be more. I haven't checked recently, but last I looked, there was 25. And it'll show you your progress on the ones that you've gone through and give you recommendations as well. So just to kind of show you how you can look at the homepage and what it does for you. And from there, how we navigate through. Now, this is still the same main web page. At the top of the page is your dashboard, and there's a few things that you can locate through there. First, when you hover over the topics section, you're going to see kind of the photo that's got the gentleman looking up and to the right. It'll show you some of the popular topics that are available, and you can also get to all topics that are available there. There's a resource on ways to learn. So I mentioned kind of earlier on, I tend to do really good with, really well with infographics, right? That's how I could just go find some infographics to look at and then explore from there. There's also Start Here guides, which are just really nice, all-encompassing documents on topics that maybe you're not terribly familiar with just yet. And you can also access your favorites here, right? The favorite scholarships that you put together, your favorite content and tools and recommendations. So that's kind of your main area for navigating around iGrad, that topic section. Now, brand new to the platform is their mindfulness section. That's what you're seeing at the bottom left of the screen. They recently added, as I mentioned early on in the presentation, meditations. This is where the Your Money personality assessment is, and that journaling option that's there as well. I highly recommend taking a peek at it. It's something you can really easily integrate into your practices. A really great example of this, if I were thinking about the context of the presentation today, we had a chance to kind of go through the budgeting process and understanding needs versus wants, or the way that our personality influences our money and how we feel about things. Well, if you're using the journal, right, and it does have a date component, you can go back in and search through them. You can categorize them. They have opportunities to kind of aggregate in that way. Let's say you see in your analysis, there was a period in time in the month that things just looked way off. You know, your spending was way out of whack. It wasn't where you thought it was going to be. You can then go back and look at the journal and see, oh, there was something going on here that had me very stressed. Clearly, that's something that I need to be aware of, and I can then use that to just, again, look for that control component we talked about early on, right? Controlling the things that we can. So this is just to show you how you start navigating around. Of course, if you get stuck on anything, that's what I'm here for. I strongly encourage you to reach out. And my contact information is listed here on the screen. Now, there were other questions we received in relation to some of the things that are kind of explicit either to private lending or international students. Some of them were related to job opportunities. I went ahead and put the university resources that are available for those in the slides. This way you have access to them. You'll also be getting resources from the Military and Veterans Affairs Office for those people that may be interested in it, and the Student Accounts Office, which is really helpful. But that actually concludes the bulk of our presentation today. I want to make sure that I didn't forget to address any of the questions that came up. Taking a peek right quick. Let's see. I know that there are a few resources that I'll be sharing with you in relation to investing as an international student, which you'll see that in the materials for the presentation. We have some questions related to, do you recommend using your credit card as if it were a debit card, aka paying off your credit card balance ASAP? So that's a great question. We can't make a specific recommendation, but something that you want to consider. Your billing cycle is important in the context of building credit, right? There's no reason you can't borrow and then immediately pay it off, because that ultimately prevents interest from accruing. But if you pay it in advance of the statement date, you don't actually have anything due. So it doesn't necessarily count the same way. It doesn't show positive payment history. It shows no payment was due. So you want to make sure that you're at least aware of that in that context, if what your goal is to build credit with the minimal to no interest associated with it. Beyond that, there's, again, a couple of questions about inflation, which I know there's some resources that I'll be sharing with you. As far as getting started with investing, I think I touched on it briefly. Often retirement planning is the first place that people will start to engage with it. And then the last question that I wanted to touch on is, how do we choose what credit cards to get, and what do you need to apply for credit cards as an international student? So some credit cards may require something like a social security number, but not necessarily all of them. Some may be willing to take a TIN number or an alternate type of number. So you want to go ahead and get in contact with the individual entity to find out for sure. As far as choosing the credit card, if you're being given multiple options, my recommendation is to sit down and review the terms and conditions for that lending opportunity one-to-one, right? You want to take a look at the interest rate and what they're offering to you and any rewards or services that come with it. And then think about what your needs are within the context of your finances, right? Is it important for you to have, a rewards program? Do you travel a lot? Maybe there's something to a benefit there. Or is the lowest interest rate really important because you know that you're going to have a period of time in which you can't pay the entirety of the balance? There's a lot of things that you want to consider. It's just about looking and reading the information that's there. And then if you have questions, getting in touch with the entity that's offering the opportunity. They're there to answer those questions, and they can be a really great resource for you. Now, if there's anything that comes up that I haven't touched on today, please do not hesitate to reach out. My email address is on there for you. It's financialwellness@columbia.edu. That, again, comes directly to me. And I'm so, so appreciative of everyone that came to the session and is reviewing this second portion of it, since we ran out of time yesterday. But again, it's all really good information. If there's anything I can clarify, please let me know. But for now, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, or good night.